Good morning, good morning, good morning. Welcome and thank you again for joining me for another Wednesday watercolor demonstration. So I see that I have quite a few people waiting for me to start, so I'm going to jump right in. Thank you so much. And if you are just joining, well, be sure and write in the comments where you're from. Everybody likes to see that. So I'm just going to switch over here now to my demonstration. And a couple of weeks ago, I did a demonstration on doing textures and things, and we'll be using a lot of that. But now I want to show how to incorporate some of those textures and maybe a few new ones into a actual painting. So I love these rocks. Everyone's so different, and you've got craggy, jagged rocks, and then you've got round rocks and all kinds of things. So it's so much fun. So good morning. Oh, Boston. We have Boston, Blackpool, UK, Washington, Oakville, Ontario, Stony Creek. Awesome. Waterloo, Toronto. Thank you so much for joining me. Okay, so I have no drawing here. With rocks are not like portraits, right? So with a portrait, of course, you have to be like completely accurate. But I think I can create my own rocks here, and if I'm a little bit off, it really won't matter. Oh, good morning from Germany too, and Sweden. Awesome, thank you so much. All right, so I am going to just start off with my big rocks here. And I'm just going to have that running off the edge there. And I've got another one here that's looks like it's got leopard spots, something like that. I'm drawing with my screen monitor instead of looking at my actual page, but another one that's like a bean. So I'll usually put in the large ones first. Okay, didn't do that one the right way, but it doesn't matter, right? So they're rocks, for heaven's sake. So put the big ones in because they're the ones that sort of wedge up against the small one, but then there'll be all these little ones in here too. So I'll try not to do too many small ones because if I do too many small ones, we'll be here until 3 o'clock. So, which would probably be fun, but I have a project this afternoon I have to teach. So just going to get a few more big ones in here. Like I said, the shapes aren't going to be that crucial, but what is important is to make them different, to make them different sizes, different shapes. Try not to make them all, all equal and all perfectly spaced. Now this particular picture, this one I am looking directly down at the stones, and so you're going to get a completely different perspective if you're looking sort of at a 45-degree angle and you've got stones overlapping other stones. Then you have to draw them a little bit differently. So but this one really doesn't have a whole lot in terms of strange perspective or anything like that. Now that's about all I will draw. As for the small ones, I'm just going to throw those ones in. I'll just make them up. So I'm going to leave some of the painting to my brush, or some of the drawing, I should say, to my brush. All right, so over here on my palette, I have softened up all my paints here. So I've added water to my. Added water to my all my colors with an eyedropper. Really cover them up so that the so that the paints have a chance to soften all the way through, not just the surface, but all the way through. That's how I'm going to get the rich color. Okay, so first of all, like any other painting that I do, I am looking for whether or not I have any white areas that I need to maintain. I don't really think I do. I have light areas. There are light areas, but do I need to keep absolute white paper? I'm not sure. I could add a little bit of white with this if I wanted to. So I am going to take, this is my masking fluid. And my masking fluid is, it's a brand called Demco Artist Series. It actually comes white, but I have added a few drops of cobalt blue to this in order for me to be able to see it when I put it on my paper. Now see how runny it is? You want to have thinner masking fluid. You know, if you're using masking fluid that's thick, or if it's getting really smelly or gummy or anything like that, it's gone. I would just replace it because it has a short shelf life. It doesn't last forever. So I'm going to now come in with a damp fan brush. Now I'm working on Arches 140-pound cold press paper. This sheet is just a little bigger than 8 by 10, so I'll end up with an 8 by 10 painting. I have pre-stretched it on gator board or watercolor board. I wet it, I stapled it down, dried it overnight, and then I just taped my edges this morning. So I want to get a little bit of texture in here, so I'm going to dip my, first of all I'm going to put soap on my brush because I don't want to wreck my brush. This is a little tiny fan brush. This is soap. This is brush cleaning soap, but any soap will do. So you could use like a bar of soap or liquid soap or anything like that. Coat the bristles, and then the masking fluid won't cling to them, so it'll come off easily. So I'm going to dip into my masking fluid here, and I'm going to tap. Ooh, nice little dots. They might take a little while to dry, but the thing I like about using a fan brush for this is that it I can hold it pretty close to the surface and give it a little tap, and you'll see it's not going all over the place, and that's why I prefer this method as opposed to a toothbrush. You can see that the more tapping I do, the finer the little dots get. Dip in again and just look, maybe there's a few other stones that'll have some dots and texture in them, so I'll just go for it. Now little dots really shouldn't take too long to dry. These ones will take the longest because they're the largest drops. And so I'm going to rinse that out of my brush. Get masking fluid out of your brush quickly before it dries. And what can I do while I'm waiting for that to dry? Well, I can come in and spatter some darks as well. So I've rinsed this brush out, so it's perfectly fine again, and I'm going to go into some colors and start adding in some colors. I'm going to start maybe with some Payne's Gray, and in my palette I'm just mixing this into my fan brush. I'll give it one tap on my paper towel just to make sure I don't get a big blob. And I'm going to look. Tapped a little too much off. So all this tapping gives me so much texture right off the bat. So I'm not painting on just plain white paper. And I'm going to try some different colors in here too. I'm going to try some blues and get some really interesting colors happening here. I see quite a bit of blue in this. Now, as I paint over this texture, a lot of this is going to get softened, and I'm probably going to come back and do a little more spatter. I'm not going to just leave it at this. But I can work back into this as long as I make sure that all these droplets are dry. I'll mix it up, maybe put some pink in here now. So I'll just use a little pinky red, so permanent rose or alizarin crimson or something along those lines would work. And just get a little bit of that in here, a little bit of yellow, like all kinds of colors spattered into here. I'm going to go less bright yellow. I think I'll use more of a raw sienna for this. Okay, so I've got some spattering. I can always add more. Rocks are the most fun. They're the most fun because they're, you know, the precision doesn't need to be there, right? You don't have to have the you know, the likeness like in a portrait or something like that. So let me just, I'm gonna speed this up here and dry this with cool air. I have masking fluid on here, remember? So I don't want to heat it up in any way. I'll bake it onto my paper. But I'm going to just quickly dry this. So I'll mute myself and use my cool setting. Okay, so I have a cool setting on my dryer. Okay, so my paper towels ended up on the floor because of the blow dryer. There's a couple of spots that are still just a little bit too wet, so I'm going to blot them, just blot off a couple of the bigger drops. All right, and make sure I don't have anything still wet there. So I'm going to come in with a big brush. Bobby's asking, do I supplement my palette with other colors? Absolutely. In fact, I have multiple palettes. So I have some really small palettes that I use to put my extra colors in. I have like a ridiculous amount of paint. Not because I've purchased it all, but sometimes I get free samples. Sometimes somebody's aunt passes away and they used to paint, and here, Shelley, you're the only artist I know. So I get a lot of paints given to me as well. And the problem I was having is that my palette didn't really have any additional wells to put it into. So I purchased extra like small palettes. Let me grab one so I can show you. So my surplus paints end up in additional palettes, right? So I try to group them as much as I can. So I'll have like, this one's got reds and blues, and this one's got yellows and greens and that sort of thing. And you can see I do such a good job of cleaning them up when I'm done. But yeah, and obviously I need another palette because these ones are both full. But yes, that is a problem, right? When you have a palette, you want to keep it minimal. You don't want to travel with every paint you have, and you know, or boxes of tubes or anything like that. Especially if you're like going to a class, or if you're going to, you know, plein air painting or something like that. You don't want to carry it all with you. But a little palette like that, a little plastic, lightweight palette, I can carry that along and no problem. All right, so I am going to start thinking about some colors in here. So it's mainly cool grays that I'm seeing in the rocks here, and you know, that's pretty typical, but there will be some odd colored ones. So I especially like this one right here with the freckles on it. So it is kind of a, it's kind of like gray on top of a very light pink or something. So I'm going to begin with a very soft pink. So I'm taking a little bit of raw sienna and adding that to it so I get something really pale. I'm going to dilute it down, and I'm going to paint this rock this color. And you'll see that the spattering and the textures that I put underneath there, they're still going to show through. I don't need to fuss. They're going to bleed a little bit. I think that that's even more interesting. So then you'll have a whole combination of, you know, crisp little speckles, and then you'll have some softer ones. Gives a little bit more dimension to the rock. All right, so let's look for a few more odd colored rocks. There's pink ones over here. There's a little pink in this one too. Maybe I'll do this one here as well. I don't really have to worry too much about staying in the lines. They're rocks. I can change them. And let's put a few more spots in here. And there's some greenish ones. So how about if I get into some greens? So maybe I'll take some of my blue and mix that into my raw sienna. That's cobalt blue, raw sienna. Then I don't get a really like bright green. I get kind of a more neutralized green. And I'll do a few with this. That's kind of a light rock down there. Won't worry about that one. I'm just looking for a few places where I can put some different colors of rock in here. And the rock doesn't have to be like a solid color either. Like, look at the variety you can put in this. I can make it sort of half and half. Sometimes you get a rock that has green on one half and a little bit more, maybe a little more pink on the other half. That's the beautiful thing about rocks, right? So nice and wet. I'm not worried about blossoms or any of that stuff. Okay, and let's put a little blue in this one. All right, so I'm just coming in here now. Most of this is just a wash of a blue-gray. So I have a little masking fluid on here, so there will be little specks and things, but you can see I'm really not concerned about staying in the lines at this point. And it may look like I'm going too dark, but it will end up much lighter by the time the darks go in there, so not worried about it. This is that really light one, so I will just use water there. And so I've got variety in here. I've got some lights, darks, warms, cools, all kinds of things. It's so nice not to have to worry about things like this. There. All right, so I'm going to start thinking about putting in some shading into these rocks, because the one thing that I need to create is form. So the rocks are going to need to have shape before I really get into some of the finer detail and the textures and things like that. So, good morning. Right, I'm pulling up my sleeves here. Really get into it. So I'm going to start coming in now with some of this Payne's Gray. Actually, I'll dry it a little bit first, I think, because if I come into this too wet, all my rocks will bleed together. So just give me one more minute to dry this quickly. I don't need to look for 100% dry in this case, but I am going to start coming in now. I'm using a smaller brush. Well, I'm not going to go too small just yet. I'm going to stay with my bigger brushes. I will graduate to my smaller brushes. So I'm going to take a, what's this one? This one's a #2 squirrel hair brush. That's what I'm using, but any round brush is fine. You know, if it's a synthetic brush, that's fine. Don't agonize over the right brush for this stage. So I'm going to take a little bit of Payne's Gray in my brush, and I'm going to start with this rock right here, and I'm going to come in and I'm going to, with a wet brush, okay, so my brush is fairly wet, I'm going to come in and add some shadow. Rinse and blot my brush and soften this. I could also approach this by wetting the rock first. That would be another alternative. But first and foremost, I need to create the form. So I'm going to create the form, and then I'll start really worrying about a lot of the texture. I'm going to come in here and just dabble in a little bit of texture into this. Sorry, turn that off. And then I'll find another one. Now, my paper is not 100% dry. It's still a little bit wet. So it's going to allow me to paint into it and not be so totally crisp. I'm just going to really get some of this wet in here. Don't even have to worry too much about the little rocks in there yet. But I'm going to start creating the shadows. So I'm looking for the shapes on the rocks themselves. And then I will come in and do the shadows between the rocks, because that's the thing that really makes them stand out. But first I want to get the contours of the rock. This one's a little bit dark right there. So put that shadow on there. Rounds off here a little bit. Rinse, wet it. I'm working pretty sloppy here. That's almost on purpose, because if I try to get too neat about it at this stage, I'll end up overworking it, making it look too contrived, too hard edged, and all of that sort of thing. So I'm really trying to keep this nice and flowing at this point. Now our main rock, you can see that it's rounded because it gets a little darker along this lower edge. So I need to come in and darken this. And look at all those blues that are going to melt into this color. Really come in and get this wet. Like I said, rocks are the most fun because you don't have to be that precise about them. All right, so really creating that roundness to it. There's a little bit on the other side as well. So I'm going to come in here with a little bit more, not quite as much shadow on the other side, but we need to create the volume of that rock first. All right, so we're creating that roundness. And so I'm just going to come in on all of the rocks, and I'm going to start making shapes. Like, not every rock is round, not every rock has a smooth surface. Sometimes they have a bit of a chunk out of it or something like that. So you can look for those things. Quickly rinse and get that paint flowing. Let me just show you how to wet it first and then add the water, or add the shadows in. That's just put clean water on and then work into that. Now then it tends to spread out more, like bleed a little bit more, but works quite well too. Some of these rocks have almost a warm tone, so how about if I come into a little bit of burnt sienna and put a little of that in there too. Get some really good texture going here. Oops, I went into the wrong color there. Burnt sienna. Burnt sienna is a great color for warming up cools. Okay. I'm going to go up into little bit more up in here and create these rocks. Make one of them warm and one of them cool, just because I can. So I'm using my reference as a guideline. I'm not using it as a Bible. I really need to make sure that I'm not being so tight and so restricted by it that it becomes stifling. All right, so everything's really wet at the moment. I've got a lot of wet stuff happening, but I'm going to come in with a little bit of shape on just a couple more of the big ones, and then I'm going to start switching my brush and creating some of the smaller shapes. Let's go more blues in some of them. So I'm switching it up all the time. I'm changing from a cool to a warm. So my reds and my yellows and my oranges, they're warm, and the blues and the greens and such grays, they're all cools. So I'm switching it up so I have some variety. And I'm going to switch to a smaller brush. So I'm going to come to this is a number 8 squirrel hair brush, round squirrel hair brush. But again, another round brush is fine. My preference is a brush that holds lots of water, but when you're working in some of the smaller shapes, and I'm doing the smaller shapes last because the smaller shapes really need to be done on drier paper, because if it spreads too much, like these ones spread out like crazy, and if the smaller rocks start spreading out too much, then I won't have any control. So, I mean, I want to zoom in on this just so you can see I'm really not being that careful. Like, see all my edges, and like, I'm really not staying in the lines. I'm just trying to get the main shapes in there quickly. But maybe I'll stay zoomed in on this corner here just to show you how I can create some of the smaller rocks. All right, so I'll go a little, I'll try to change them up so that I have some warms and cools. Oops. Put the color in and then soften it, or I can also wet an area first and then add that in. But now I just for fun, I think I'd like to add in a little salt on some of these, because salt is a great way to get texture on rocks as well. So while it's wet, you can only do it when it's wet. Actually, I think that's a little too dry, but I will put this in and put a little more shadow into it. Because anything that you're going to use salt on, you need to do it kind of on the first layers, because otherwise if you get too many layers on, you don't get the effect. So I'll put a little salt on there. We'll get a little interesting rock right there. So I'll do that a couple of times. This is just regular table salt, nothing fancy, just regular old table salt. You can get some great textures if you use things like pickling salt, or I don't think I've tried kosher salt yet. Road salt, not so much. I actually had a class once where somebody didn't have any salt, and there was by the door there was some roads, like some salt that you put on your like on your driveway when there's ice and stuff, but it was monster size salt. And it really didn't work very well. But so there's an extreme that you can go to, of course, but Kind of made me laugh. She had like these like pea-sized pieces of salt on her painting, but so I'm going to just do a few more rocks here. I'm just going to put in a bit of color and shade it. Let's throw a little salt in that one. And we'll see how that turns out. Now I'm painting into salt, so I want to make sure I'm rinsing off my brush so I'm not reintroducing salt to my palette. I don't want to do that. Just rinse and... Now sometimes you'll get little rocks that will almost hide underneath a bigger rock, right? So maybe half a stone. So let's do a half stone here. And again, I'm not even really looking at my reference at this point. So if you're looking at the reference, don't take it too literally. I'm creating my own design here. And I'll do a couple of dark rocks too. So I'm trying to make a combination of warm and cool and also of dark and light. The name of this palette, okay, this palette that I'm using here, it is a Speedball. It's called a color wheel palette, and for obvious reasons, it's laid out like a color wheel. I get a lot of inquiries about this. There's another one, Stephen Quiller palette is also very similar. The difference of the Stephen Quiller palette is that it actually is square, so you end up with a couple of other extra wells in the corners. It is pricier, but that's another option. Okay, so I want a different colored rock here. I want to put a green rock in here. I have greens on my palette. I could use some sap green. You can mix your green. Pretty much any yellow mixed with Payne's Gray makes a very interesting green. You might like that. And of course, as I paint one rock touching another rock, they will bleed into each other. That's okay. I don't mind that once in a while, but I don't want it every time. Okay, sometimes you get a long skinny rock, then you get a squared rock or a rounded rock. Lots of variety. Okay, so I'm getting the little bits and pieces in here. All right. I'm going to come into this one again and just get a little bit more volume to it. So I'm increasing the shadow on this one. Rinse and soften that as I go. And you can see it's pretty runny stuff that I'm doing right now, but you can already see the stones starting to form. And then there's going to be this really small gravelly type of stuff underneath between even these small ones here. So these are like the large, and these are going to be like the medium. Then you're going to have this little stuff in here. Now the little stuff in between, I'm not going to paint individual rocks. That's just a little bit too silly. And I'm going to just, these are too wet to work in right now, but I'm going to do a little area here with some of that gravelly stuff. Actually, before I do that, here, I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to dry this little area here, and I'm going to dry it quickly, and then I'll be able to show you how to put the in-between little pieces of rock. So I'm going to mute while I do this. Okay. Now I'm hurrying things along because we're live, but normally I would allow things to dry. I would be working elsewhere and everything else. I just want to try to cover as much as I can in an hour. So thank you, Jan. Yes, my the colors that I have on my palette are listed on my Facebook page, and I can actually maybe quickly go through, but I have Payne's Gray, Neutral Tint, Quinacridone Violet, Alizarin Crimson, Permanent Rose, Opus, which I use sometimes for flowers because it's very bright, Rose D'Or, Sepia, Burnt Sienna, Quinacridone Gold, Raw Sienna, Gamboge, Aureolin, Leaf Green. I don't actually use that one too much, but I might switch that one up one day. I have Sap Green, Hooker's Green. This one is Cobalt Turquoise. Then I have Cerulean Blue, Cobalt Blue, French Ultramarine Blue, and Indanthrone Blue. So that's what I have in my palette. I have actually labeled everything with these little tabs. You can see I've got these little tabs. When I put the lid on, they flatten down again. But I do this. I had to do this when I first set up my palette, because if you're setting up a new palette, oh, for heaven's sake, do a legend, do like mark the actual palette or something like that. Now, because I do switch up my colors, that's why I'm using these little tabs, because sometimes I like to change my mind. So this is my palette today, but in 5 years from now, I might discover a new paint. I like to experiment. I like to evolve. You know, this might not be my palette in 5 years, but today it's my palette. So that's what I'm using. And they are mainly transparent colors, but just keep in mind that transparent colors are, like transparency is a sliding scale. It's not, it's transparent or it's not. There's semi-transparent, there's semi-opaque, there's opaque. I don't really have any opaque colors on here. Mine are mostly transparent, so, or at least close to transparent as that particular color can be. So, so I'm going to come in between some of these rocks with a wet brush here. So I'm just picking up some Payne's Gray, and I'm going to go in between. Let's go a little darker. I'm going to go in between here with some Payne's Gray, and I'll drop some other colors into it as well. I can even spatter into this with clean water, but there's kind of small areas, so I don't think I'll do that. But now you'll notice that what I'm doing here is I'm working around, and now I'm shaping these mid-sized rocks, these smaller stones. So we'll call this rock, stone, and gravel. Okay, so that's kind of like the differences here. So I'm going in between and Now normally I would have the salt all brushed off and all that stuff happening, but I wanted to get to this point. So at least I can give you one corner and you'll have an idea of where this is headed. Okay, so I don't want to have that just too plain, so I'm going to come in with little bits of maybe red and drop it in while it's wet. Maybe some, here, let's drop a little aureole in and see what happens. We'll get some green out of that. So we'll get a little bit of variation in there, just so it's not all gray. So we have something a little more interesting. So in between here, so I'm basically painting all those little white gaps between the stones at this point. But first things first, we have to get the shapes on the stones and all of that sort of thing. And I'll just let that dry. And then I'll start coming in and really getting some of the shapes and shadows built up. Oh, good morning, Chris. Now I know that everybody who watches isn't able to see the chat, and I'm not really sure why that is. But those of you that can't add to the chat for whatever reason, I want to say good morning to you too as well, but feel free to put comments. I can't see the comments as I'm teaching this live or as I'm demonstrating live. It's not really a class. But as I'm demonstrating this, I can't read the comments, but I will read them after the live stream. And if you have questions, I'll answer them at that time. So sorry if I can't answer them as we go along, but I will answer them after. So I'm coming in between, and now I'm really creating the shapes of these stones. Okay, so I'm really starting to fill things in and I'll be coming in with some darker darks and lots of things after this. So I'm going to have to dry this again so that I can keep going on this, right? But getting this shape on the big rock here, look how that's making this look dimensional, that it actually is rounded. Now it does have a bit of texture on it, but the texture isn't really creating the form. The form comes first. You make the form first, then you focus in on a lot of the detail, the texture, and things like that. So I'm going to dry this, and I'm going to come over and visit something else. Well, actually, I can do that now. I don't have to dry this. Let's just move over to this other section here. So I'm going to come over to this one, and I'm going to take my masking fluid again because it has freckles. I love the freckles on this particular rock. And remember, I had said that that the rock was a little pinkish underneath. So I'm going to take a synthetic brush, put soap on it. This is just a small round brush. Everybody has their own favorite method of masking. I prefer a brush. That's my personal preference. Sometimes I use, if it's a really small detail, I'll use a dip pen. A lot of people like to use those rubber shapers. Some people just use like a barbecue skewer or things like that, or the end of a brush, or the handle of a brush. I find that I don't get the accuracy for certain things the way I want to, but on a rock like this, it's not going to be that important. So I'm just going to put some big blobs on here. I'll try not to make them too thick because it'll just take too long to dry. But I want to get a little bit more of the bigger blobs in here. And you have to be careful with stuff like this because it's so easy, like incredibly easy, to make this like a wallpaper pattern and just make it all the same. I don't know what it is about human nature that makes us do that, but we want to organize and line up everything and make it all the same, and it's not in nature anyway. So these are all irregular shapes and sizes, and I will make a straight edge along the side of the stone there. But even if I didn't, it would be okay because I could come around that and shape it better later. But there is quite a bit of this freckly leopard spot kind of thing. And I'm going to put some smaller ones on this one too. It's a similar type of stone, just not as freckly. Oop, maybe you can't see that. Won't put as much on that one. That should be enough. So that's going to take a little while to dry, which is why I wanted to do it right now. And then I'll come back to do my other corner here. Rinse out my brush, get my lid back on my masking fluid. And by the way, this masking fluid, you can see I've got it in a little jam jar, is not the full bottle. This isn't how it comes. It's just obviously jam. I pour the amount that I think I'd like to use, the little cup size, in separately, and then I tint that. The rest of the bottle is still white. Sometimes I might want to change my masking fluid and make it a different color, you know, depending on what it is I'm doing. If I'm painting on top of something that's already painted, well, if it's already painted blue, I don't want to put blue masking fluid on top of it. I might put a little burnt sienna or something like that into my masking fluid to make it a different color so that I can see it on my surface. So buying the masking fluid white and then you know, adding your preferred color to it is better. But word of warning, you must use a color that won't stain your paper. If you're not sure if it stains, look it up on the manufacturer's website. Almost every manufacturer of watercolor will have a listing of their paints and their characteristics, whether it's staining, whether it's fugitive, whether it's granulating, transparent, opaque, whatever it is. It will usually have a listing. And sometimes that's, if you can read the label, or even when you're in the store, sometimes they have it listed on the name. You might see the S for staining. That's what that will mean. There are symbols for each of those characteristics because the little paint tubes are pretty small. It's hard to put it all on there, but transparent color in watercolor is indicated with a little square that's blank in the middle. Semi-transparent is a square with a diagonal line, half of it black, half of it plain white. And opaque color is indicated by a square that is filled in black. Okay, so that's sort of the universal symbols for opaque or transparent or semi-transparent watercolor. So I'll just get a Sharpie here to show you. So on my tape here, this would be, if you see this symbol on your paint tube or on the shelf when you're buying your paints, that means it's transparent. This one means semi-transparent, and this one will mean opaque. where it's all filled in. Okay, so that's it's the transparent, or semi-transparent, or opaque. So you might see initials in there for that instead. So that's what you're looking for in your paint. So that's what I have mostly in my palette. And while I've killed that little bit of time talking, I'm going to come back and I'm going to start to really develop this one little area. I won't get the whole painting done. I mean, I could spend hours painting on this and have a heck of a lot of fun doing it, because there are painters that love to paint fast, and they want to get it done, and then they just end up with a lot of really fast paintings, and that might be their temperament. I love the process, and I love fussing and playing with my colors, not overworking. There's a difference. I love painting, and I love taking my time and picking out the details, but I don't go back and back and back and back fixing things. Okay, so there's a difference between adding and fixing. So I keep adding, I keep building. I try as much as possible not to have to fix something. Very often what I will do instead of fixing something is I will incorporate it. I'll find a way to incorporate something I don't like into my painting. And if I simply can't do it, well, I will just, at that point, I will just try again. I'll start a new painting. All right, so this one's on top, so it's going to have a lot of shadow in behind it. So I'm going to come in, this is Payne's Gray, which is a lot more opaque at this point, so less water. I'm using a brush with a nice point here to get into all these nooks and crannies. And I'm really going to get the shape of this rock defined. Now, as I get into the area with the gravel, okay, the really fine stuff, I can actually paint around a few little bits and pieces here. Just sort of do a little bit of, leave some gaps in what I'm painting. Like I said, I could spend hours doing this, but I won't. Could I spell the name of the masking fluid? Yes, it is, and it's available in Canada. I don't know where you are, Billy, or Bobby, I should say. It is called Demco. Artist series, and it is, I believe it's made in Quebec somewhere, so I'm not sure if they distribute to the US, but check that out. Honestly, there's a lot of really good brands of masking fluid out there, lots of them. There's, they all work pretty well, but I would suggest when you go to the store to buy your masking fluid, pick up the bottle, give it a little shake, make sure it's fluid. You may buy masking fluid and assume that it's fresh right off the shelf, but don't forget, that could have been sitting in a warehouse for who knows how long. It may have been overheated in a truck somewhere, like you just don't know. So when I go to a store and I'm buying masking fluid, I will give it a little bit of a shake, make sure that it's flowing nicely, that I've got fresh masking fluid. I can't emphasize enough the importance of fresh masking fluid because it really will make a big difference. It has such a short shelf life. I don't use enough of it to warrant buying a big bottle. But if I were doing something, if I were a watercolor painter who does pouring, that's another technique. You use a lot of masking fluid for that. So I would probably buy a bigger one for that. Now you see what I just did is that little spot, it was a spot just like this one here, and I came in and I broke it up with all different little shapes. And basically you can do like a bunch of crisscross and then just round off the points on some of them. But there's you want a lot of different sizes and shapes. But there's another long one sticking in there or something. And so I can break that up and make that look like little tiny gravel. You know, if I break it up, the more I break it up, the finer it'll look. With all those different colors that I dropped in there, it makes it look like different colored stones. But I didn't paint individual stones. That's a little excessive. So I'm going to come in here and make sure that I have some good, strong definition between some of these rocks. Some of these areas might just be dark. You know, there's a lot of shadow on it, for example. Let's add a little more shadow onto some of this. Like that. You know, as if this rock is making more shadow on it and that sort of thing. And you'll see that as I do these little bits in between, oh, the stones themselves, the larger stones around it, they're going to need a little more attention. So I will come in and add a little bit more there to make these forms look a little bit more convincing. So here, for example, I'll come in with more shadow on this rock. Rinse and soften. This one, come in and get a little bit darker here. And I'll just keep creating my dimensions and my shading on these rocks. And the bottom of the rock doesn't have to be just a beautiful, smooth application of shadow or value there. You can sorry, I was just reading the comments here. Joy says, incredible white by graphics is the best masking fluid. I haven't tried that one. Everybody has a favorite, and I don't know. I guess, you know, if it's your favorite, you're going to say it's the best, and if you're a manufacturer, you're going to say it's the best and everything else. But everybody else has, you know, everybody has different favorites. I think that's what makes us so interesting as artists. We're all different. As I said, I haven't tried that one, so I'm passing no judgment on that. But I will take your word for it that it is a good brand. I'm not a brand ambassador, by the way. I don't represent any particular company. I do have a lot of Da Vinci watercolors, but I have a reason for that, and it's mainly because my local store carried it. It was their moderately priced artist quality watercolor, and I started using it because I needed to consider the budget of my students who might be buying watercolors for the first time. So I needed to consider that, and I needed something that was available to my classes locally. Also, if I were teaching abroad, or, you know, if I were teaching somewhere else in the country, I wanted to make sure that, you know, it was something that they could access by ordering online. If they didn't happen to have a, you know, an art store nearby that carried, you know, what I have. Because generally I find that as I'm teaching workshops, people do like to have the very same thing that I have, even though it's not that important. There are so many colors that are really similar or exactly the same in different brands. So if you get a list from an instructor, for example, and you get a list of colors and the name. So let's say, for example, you want a permanent rose, you know, and the teacher's using a certain brand, and then you look up the permanent rose in another brand, but you're not sure if it's the same, or it might even be it might even go by a different name. So sometimes, like, artists can have their own brands of paint sometimes. So you know, you can't use the same name if you're using the same color. If it's going under your name, you can't call it the same thing. So, you know, people will change the names, but in essence, it's the same color. So all of the tubes will have, like, you know, PR, which would mean pigment red or pigment rose, whatever, or PB, which would be blue, right? Pigment blue. And then there'll be a number behind that. And it will basically tell you what that pigment is. So regardless of the brand you're using, if you learn those, well, I don't have them memorized myself. I'm terrible about it. But if I needed to look it up, I could look it up. All of this information's available quite readily online. You can see this area is really starting to develop now. And just imagine the whole thing done, right? Just imagine the entire painting developed. I want to wait a little bit longer, see if I can get this dry so I can get that rock done. I really want to get that done, but the paint's on there, or the masking's on there, and it's taking a little while. So I'm going to plod along here a bit, working in between some of these rocks in the same sort of way. So nice dark Payne's gray here. The lowest sort of level, if the big rocks are going to sit up higher than the medium-sized rocks, and the gravel's going to be all at the bottom. So the gravel's at the bottom, so it's not only smaller, but it's darker. So it's right at the bottom, and so I'm working. That's why I have to work around these stones here. Not as much light can get down here in between the rocks. So I also want to be careful not to fall into the trap of completing every line and making every rock look like it has an outline on it. So you'll notice on this rock here, if I zoom in on it. Okay, so this rock right here, I was using the dark, right? And I was creating a lot of these darks. And here I have kind of a dark line there. But I don't have a dark line outlining the rock in front. So as you're doing these little rocks in between, or the little bits of gravel in between, don't fall into the trap of outlining all of your rocks. It will make it very cartoony. So that won't be the best look. All right, so into some of this. And I can actually hint at a few more little rocks and things in here. Rocks are like one of my favorites. I mean, I say that about everything. Everything I'm working on is my favorite thing at that moment. So I'll say, oh, glass is my favorite, or birds are my favorite, or portraits are my, and I'm always changing my mind. I know they say that artists, to get known and everything, you need to have a niche and have it like be known for one thing and everything. I suppose that's true. And I understand all the reasons why. But gosh, there's just so many things I love painting. I don't know if I could do it. But I just love painting, so I just paint what I like. I just try to teach, and I teach a lot, so of course that means that you know, I need to have variety as well. If I'm teaching in my area and I'm teaching in-person classes, gosh, if I kept teaching the same thing, how many times do you think people would come back? Not too often, right? I'm just reading some of the comments. Joyce says she bought some of these brushes. These ones are like little travel brushes. You can see the name is Baya Elk. Take a snapshot of that if you want, but it's a travel brush, so the end comes off and you just feed it back in there and toss it in your paint bag, so it's kind of a handy thing, but they're inexpensive. Yeah, I thought they were a pretty good deal, but I really like them. Boy, they have the best point on them. So I'm doing some bigger stones and slightly bigger stones. Nothing too colorful down there, but I can come in and paint little bits of other colored stones. Let's do another red one here. Let's have a red one that goes a little blue too. It'll be kind of like a purple rock. My colors might seem a little bit brighter than what you're seeing in the actual reference picture, because if I did it exactly, like if I matched that coloring, it would look good, but I like color, and I think, you know, I just like to embellish it a little bit more, take a little artistic license with it. Where can I work? This, I still can't work on this one. Still can't work on this one because the masking fluid is still wet, but this one is dry. So I'll work on this one instead. And I'm going to come in with some blues and blue-gray, so cobalt and Payne's gray. And I'm going to come in on here and just get that paint flowing. Clean water down here. It's not all going to be the same value, right? Some of it's got more color than others. And I might even warm this up a little bit, so I think I'll put a little burnt sienna here, just a whisper of it, just enough to get that warm, cool thing going on. Okay, so it looks dark, but we haven't, like when the masking comes off, those brights will come back. And I think I wouldn't mind spattering into this a little bit while it's wet. So take a little Payne's gray. I'm going to have to get it a little bit runnier if I'm going to spatter it, but not too runny, because spattering into an area wet like this will make the paint disperse really nicely. You know, we did some spattering in the beginning on dry, but now this is going to give us some real softness. Love that. Look at that texture. And I will try not to make it the same all over. And I'm getting spatters other places. Not worried about it. But if I needed to move it, I would just, you know, blot it off quick, right? Just wipe it off. Okay, so I like that texture. That's a really nice one. But it's going to keep evolving and changing as it goes. I'm going to go a whole hog here and put a little salt on here too. It's always a little bit of an experimentation with salt, you know. But you put it on while it's wet, and just watch what it's going to do. It's going to give me some more textures. So love that. And let me see. I won't go past 11:30 here, but I'll try and get a little bit more, maybe in this bottom area, done. And so let's get a few more of the areas in between done here. This is a bigger gap, so I'm going to come in with some Payne's Gray around this rock and this rock. Now it's going to be very similar to that color, or that rock beside it, but now remember, rocks are not always perfect and round, so I'm going to make this one a little bit irregular, just because that's more interesting. And coming into here, I'm going to switch it up a little bit, maybe make some more reddish color in my shadows. You have so much leeway in terms of being creative with this sort of things. Yeah, masking fluid that has been frozen, sometimes it happens if you have it delivered, and you've got to be careful of that. If it's sitting in a delivery truck and it gets frozen, that's not good for masking. So don't leave it in your car either in extreme heat or extreme cold, because your masking fluid will not survive it. So I'm going to go into my Payne's Gray again and see how much I can do in here. This little section's a bit dry, so I can come in and start creating a few more textures and rocks and gravel and stuff. And sometimes I'll just dabble in just to hint at some of the gravel. And again, watch that I'm not outlining this rock. It's almost like squiggles in here, and the illusion will be there. And if you have a big area like this, you know, mix it up with sizes, and I may paint some of these rocks in a different color later, but for now I'm just going to see if I can get that gravelly look. Just want to move something here. Okay. Let's do a slightly bigger rock here. And maybe I'll shade this with a bit of blue. I'll come in underneath here and just put some shading under it. And then I have a blue rock. Come in and shade this one. It's a little Technicolor, isn't it? So it needs a little graying down. So I'll put some Payne's Gray in there. And just some more squiggles and wiggles and different shapes and sizes. I'm going to try to avoid this for a bit yet. So I think it's still pretty wet. Don't want to be working into wet. Okay, so you get, you get the feeling of all that little gravelly bit, and I could also spatter or stipple into some of this, like dot 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 kind of thing, and create a little bit of texture in some of those stones. But I can switch up the stones as well if I take maybe some raw sienna here and just come in and pick a few that I want to put a little color into, and just blot it, and that will slightly change up some of the colors in even the little tiny gravel, just dot dot dot. So you can see how this develops, and always when you get those extra darks in, you're gonna see, oh, okay, this is gonna need a little bit more emphasis. I'm going to come along here and get this part of the rock even darker. Did it once, I'm doing it again. And let's dabble a little bit more paint in this lower part and really get that looking more dimensional. Now it's interesting, I'll have to do this sort of thing another time, but when rocks get wet, the colors really come out of them. But when they're wet, they also have a shine. So you've got all this texture, and then you've got the shine on top, and all this other stuff that you have to consider. So that's a lesson for another day. Alizarin Crimson, my primary red on the Color Wheel palette. Actually, I would say Permanent Rose for me. On my, I'm going more to Permanent Rose than I am the Alizarin Crimson. The two are a little bit different. Let me see if I have a. This isn't watercolor paper, but it's what I have on hand. Oh, actually, I'll use this piece of cardboard. So just so you can see the difference between the two, the reason I use this is Alizarin Crimson right here. And then I have Permanent Rose right next to it. And you'll see that the Permanent Rose is a little brighter. They're both single pigments, and I think the permanent Alizarin Crimson's permanent. Is one pigment, but you see that this one's a little bit cleaner. It's a brighter, more vibrant red. So that's why I choose this. But don't go, saying, well, this is the right one and that's the wrong one, because that's not the case. If you're a landscape painter, this one might be perfect as your main red in your painting, because it's not as clean. I do a lot of glass and portraits and things like that, so I want to make sure that I keep my colors clean. Single pigment colors, you know, the PG or PR or whatever, PY colors that are the pigments that you see on the thing. If it's got one of the numbers, not a whole series of them, one pigment will mix more cleanly with another pigment because you're not getting too many pigments mixed together. What would I do to make these rocks all look like if they were sitting just under the water? Okay, so then there would be a little reflection on top of the water. If these rocks were submerged in a, like, let's say they're at the bottom of a creek or something like that, and I'm taking a picture of this, well, you'd probably see some glare from the surface of the water. And so, like I said, that's a lesson for another day. Rocks in and out of water. I could get into it, but we'd be here all day. And this little bit of masking is taking a long time to dry. So I'm just going to continue shaping some of my rock here. So I'm going to come in and get my shadows on these rocks built up a little bit more. And you see, depending on, like, if I don't just shade underneath, it gives the rock a different shape, that it, you know, it almost looks like it has almost a pyramid shape because I'm bringing sort of triangles into this. Right? It's not exactly a rounded rock. It's got these shapes. Let's keep this soft. Rinse and blot my brush to soften anything here. There we go. All right, so that rock looks like it has a different shape than this rock here. Right, it's actually got different dimension. The high points of the rock are going to be left light, but the other parts aren't. Look at this texture that's happening here with the salt. Even this little guy down here has some salt on it, which is nearly dry enough. So I usually take my salt off with a little palette knife. I could brush it off with my hand, but I find I have better luck with my palette knife. You know, or you could use like a credit card, you know, to remove salt. Works well. Gets all that extra off. I'm hitting some of the masking fluid here. Why don't I remove some of that masking fluid? So for removing masking, I use this tool. Okay, so this is where what it's called, a rubber cement eraser, and you can get that. If you can't find it near the masking fluid, look where the rubber cement is. And you can see how stark some of these dots are going to be. This was the initial spattering that I did with the masking fluid. And there'll be some of that in these surrounding areas too. And I can tone some of those down easily. You know, just if I just wet this rock, and a lot of the color will melt into those areas. But that's very wet still. Okay, so my rock has little speckles of light in it as well, and let's dry this. And I'm going to see if I can remove the textures off of this one here, because I really like this one. I'm going to mute while I do this, and I'm going to use my cool setting because I have masking fluid. Joy's asking, would I consider teaching a portrait? Yes. Actually, I have a few portraits in my Zoom workshops for like every Friday. I teach a Zoom workshop, and it's much more in depth. Like, you know, I will actually finish the project, and I will cover in more detail every aspect of the project. You will get a line drawing, you'll get a reference image, you will get lifelong access to the recording, exclusive, and yeah, so and you'll get critique and that sort of thing. So I have a couple of portraits in my Zoom already. You will find those in past portraits. And incidentally, it is it's the end of February 2022 if you're watching the recording of this, but I will be posting my March and April classes in the next couple of days. So keep your eye open for that, and or anytime. You know, check at any time, and I'll have something up there. But there's a lot that are already existing that have portraits. Can I do a portrait in an hour? That's a tall order. So I can do elements of portraits. I actually have done some demonstrations on eyes, mouth, hair, things like that. So I've done little individual aspects of a portrait, focusing more on features than the entire portrait. But I'll see what I can do. All right, I'll see what I can do in terms of a portrait. Certainly I can do them in my Zoom workshops on Fridays, because those are much longer. They're about 3 hours, sometimes 5 at the most. I cap it at 5, you know. But how do you access the Zoom? You register for my workshop, and then then I send you the link. All right, so the link only goes to those who have paid. So the download is free. Like, you know, if you don't have Zoom already, you just download it, and you join. And what you're seeing on the screen right now with the reference image and my palette and me, and of course the workspace, is very similar to what you'll see in your Zoom workshop. It's just a little more extensive. I can answer questions as we go along. My demos on Wednesdays, they're free. They're sampling, you know, they're sampling of my teaching. So so let's get to this. I'm going to dry this, and I will get the masking fluid up here and see what we have. Okay, so I won't get to this one because we're already a long way into this morning, and I have a class soon. So this rock here, I kind of threw the kitchen sink at it. We have spatter on dry, then we've got washes, wet and, you know, warms and cool washes. We've got masking fluid, we've got salt, more spatter, wet on wet, that kind of thing. So first I'm going to get rid of the salt, and some of the masking will come with it, but I'm going to get rid of the salt, brush that away, then get my pickup tool and remove some of these bigger blotches of the stone. Now they look a little bit harsh, don't they, because of the masking fluid. And that is the downside to using masking fluid, right? So what am I going to do about it? Well, I can take a little brush. Let's take a little brush. and just take a little bit of the surrounding color and just soften up some of these edges so that they don't look quite as harsh. Rinse my brush and I'm just softening some of this. See if I can get some of the paint moving. Sometimes just a damp brush is enough to move fresh paint and get things softened up. But that's kind of cool. I think that's a neat rock. Put a little color in, blend it in there, just so that they're not all perfectly crisp around the outsides. Try to break that up. Yes, thank you, Melody. Yes, I do have all the instructions are on my website. So my website is right here. You can see shelleypryor.com. And if you go to the Zoom workshops page, now keep in mind I am about to update my website. So right now you're thinking, well, there's not what's coming up. You know, there's going to be more coming up in the next 2 days. So check that out. And oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to come in and start building up some more of these rocks that are hiding behind and underneath these ones here. So just coming in with a bit of Payne's Gray just to get a little bit more of this done. And I'm basically squiggling and occasionally making a bigger rock deliberately, like that. But it's mostly just squiggles and some nice shadows tucked in there. But I'm not trying to shape every little bit of gravel. I have done that. I have done that. I've been known to do that, and it's a little bit extreme. I don't really recommend it, but unless you just want to spend forever doing something, it becomes a little monotonous, but can be fabulous if you do it. You can get a really great effect, but wow, a lot of work. So tucked in between here, it's probably going to be a little darker. And probably a little darker right where this this rock is on top. And so I'm considering shadows on these little bits of gravel and stuff as well. That's now I'll color in a couple of them. Let's make a green one, greenish one. Let's make another green one. A couple of red ones, reddish ones, not bright red. I'm not coming into any of this with bright colors, just muted colors. Add a little Payne's Gray or something to it just to keep it toned down. And of course some of them are going to be shaded with Payne's Gray. So the ones that you make a little bit bigger, you can get some shadows on there. All right, so you get the idea of it. You know, you can see this little bottom part here. It's looking pretty complete. And have fun painting your rocks. Wow, that's, I could get lost in this. Just, yeah. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Lots of fun little techniques, and if you want a nice play project, this is it. You could have a lot of fun with this. And it's really hard to go wrong because nobody's going to see the reference picture. You're just going to invent it anyway. So have fun, and if you like it, give me a thumbs up, and I'll see you next time. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great week. Bye.